Hello everybody and welcome to the 12th video in our series of videos on the age of exploration. Today we are going to be looking at the Atlantic slave trade, which forcefully transports nearly 11 million people from Africa to America. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes. So by the end of this video you should hopefully know how many people were enslaved and forced to America. You guys should also know why there was such a demand for slaves and how they were enslaved, and you guys should know what was traded in the Atlantic slave trade triangle. We have talked before about the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade with the explorations of Henry the Navigator along the west coast of Africa. We talked about how initially Portugal had a small population and not enough people to do all the work, so that they started bringing slaves from Africa. These first slaves were prisoners of war. They would have fought with another state in Africa, been defeated by that state, and instead of being killed, they would have been taken prisoner. When the Portuguese arrived in West Africa, they were willing to trade goods for the prisoners of war who they forced into slavery. Slavery has always existed, but this slave trade becomes particularly grotesque or terrible when the Spanish discover America. We have seen the destruction the Spanish brought to America, particularly the spread of disease. The Spanish were now able to claim these huge amounts of lands, and initially they attempted to enslave the native Indians using something known as the Encomienda system. The Spanish promised to protect and educate the locals in exchange for labor. Unfortunately, what usually ended up happening was that Indians died from disease and harsh living working conditions. With the huge amount of diseases and the work of men such as Bartholomew de las Casas to fight for native rights, there weren't enough native workers. The Americas were full of massive plantations. They were set up and they grew things like sugarcane and cotton and tobacco. And these plantations, they required an awful lot of manpower. Portugal, they had a contract to supply slaves to these massive plantations at the beginning. The conditions on these plantations were absolutely atrocious. And to describe them would be something that it would be very uncomfortable to listen to. So we won't go into the details of it, but just take my word that the conditions on these plantations was horrific. With this massive increase in demand for slaves, more and more African states began wars now to capture slaves to sell them on. War was now being waged to capture slaves rather than before, where the people who were left over from the war were sent into slavery. The kingdoms of Africa wanted not only to get money but also to get guns to protect themselves so their neighbours couldn't defeat them and sell them into slavery. Slaves would be marched to these slave forts, as you can see here on the coast. They would be shaved to prevent lice, and then they would be branded with roaring hot pokers. They were loaded onto ships to the Americas, and around 20% of them would never see land again, mainly due to the horrific conditions on the ships. It's estimated nearly 2 million people died on the way to America. The trip to America through the Atlantic Ocean was known as the Middle Passage. The Atlantic slave trade can probably be best described or seen as a triangle. So imagine a ship arrived from Europe into Africa with guns and rum and manufactured goods. They traded these with the locals, and in exchange for these goods, the Africans gave them slaves. The ships would then be loaded up with slaves who would go to the Americas, where they would exchange these slaves for items like tobacco, sugar, and cotton, which were grown on these huge plantations. They also would have traded for gold and silver, which is flowing out of the Americas at the time as well. Places like the Potosi silver mine were churning out so much silver that the Spanish in particular became massively rich. Then these items would be shipped back to Europe, where this whole disgusting cycle would begin again. And the people who were shipping these things got filthy rich. Europeans tried to justify this slavery, to justify the enslavement of people, which was against the Catholic religion or the Christian religion as it came after the Reformation. They claimed to justify. They claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and that they were destined to be slaves. There were disgusting pamphlets that were published all along with false information. And these disgusting racist ideas, they took root in this attempt to justify slavery, and unfortunately the results of it are still being seen today. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you should know how many people were enslaved in the African slave trade or the Atlantic slave trade. So there were roughly 11 million enslaved. Nearly 2 million of them died before they even got to the Americas. You should know why there was such a demand for slaves. So there was a massive demand for slaves due to the huge plantations in the Americas. There was a lot of the native population had died from disease, so there was a real lack of manpower. How they were enslaved, again, we can look at how initially they started off as prisoners of war. As demand grew, more and more people were enslaved to be sold on. And finally, you should know what was traded on the Atlantic slave trade triangle. So again, we're talking about guns and rum and manufactured goods coming into Africa, slaves going over to America, stuff like cotton and tobacco and sugar coming back into Europe. So that's the end of the presentation. I hope you guys learned something new.